situation in Azerbaijan, I regret to say, I think has deteriorated, where the government has been cracking down a little more on opposition figures and on journalists. In the Washington Post, there's an op-ed article about the problems of lack of democracy in Azerbaijan. There was a report in the beginning of March about valuable property that the Aliyev family had in Dubai. There's the problem of corruption. It is a situation where the government is in pretty firm control. The referendum that was passed last year that basically gives Ilham Aliyev presidency for life was not a positive development. The government shut down broadcasts of RFE-RL and BBC and other Western outlets, which the U.S. and EU governments protested to no avail, though. And there continue to be journalists held in detention. So the situation internally isn't very great. On the Nagorno-Karabakh problem, I'm not terribly optimistic that there'll be any breakthroughs. The hope that came about, actually there have been several times where there has been a rise in hope that a solution might be near. Each time those hopes seem to get dashed. Just recently there were incidents where some Azerbaijani soldiers along the conflict zone were killed, raising tensions in the area. And so I do worry that this is a conflict that is not going to get solved soon, but that also has the possibility to escalate into greater violence, which would be in no one's interest. Situation in Georgia has gotten more complicated in light of the mini scandal created by this TV program that suggested Russian forces had invaded and killed President Saakashvili. A complete stupidity on the part of the MIDI TV, not clear who else was involved in this. It didn't help Saakashvili's standing in the West, it didn't help Georgia at all. And it gave Russia another opportunity to score political points against the Georgian government. That aside, Saakashvili's popularity before that had been on the rise again, and the opposition in Georgia was on the defensive. And I think the situation in Georgia remains complicated. Saakashvili is going to be the president until 2013, until the next election. And the hope is that with help from the West and even pressure from the West, that Georgia stay on a reformist track so that we don't see problems like we saw with that MIDI TV broadcast. In terms of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the Russian presence seems to be only solidifying with the establishment of military bases in both separatist regions. Russia doesn't seem to be backing off its recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. And that is a problem because the West has stood by Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia is in defiance of that. Russia has not complied with the 2008 ceasefire agreement, and yet there has been a tendency in certain Western capitals to sweep that problem under the rug, to ignore it, overlook it, in the interest of trying to reset relations with Russia, and I think that would be a major mistake. We need to remind Russian officials at every opportunity that they are not in compliance with the ceasefire agreement, that establishing bases in Abkhazia and South Ossetia is unacceptable, and that we stand by the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia. The Obama administration has done a pretty good job of that. Vice President Biden's trip to Georgia in July of last year, but more needs to be done. And the question of whether to sell Georgia defensive weapons is also one that needs to be sorted out, and so far the United States has not gone ahead and done that. Sadly, it's always a possibility. It can start because soldiers on both sides of the line had too much to drink and started shooting at each other. I mean, it doesn't take much for resumption of hostilities. And just the comments by Russian Security Council Secretary Patrushev that Georgian security services might have been involved in the recent bombings on the Moscow subway system raised a lot of concerns in Tbilisi that Moscow was looking to blame Georgia for what happened. So Medvedev, Putin both have made clear that they despise Saakashvili, they refuse to meet with him. And yet there have been some occasions where flights have resumed for a brief period. There are other efforts to establish relations, but as long as Saakashvili is there, it's hard for me to see that the situation with Russia is going to get much better. Visits by opposition figures from Georgia to Moscow have come with greater frequency. Burchinadze and Nogayedeli and others. Actually, also from Moldova, Marian Lupu was recently in Moscow and met with Prime Minister Putin. It troubles me, frankly, that opposition leaders are going for meetings with Yedina Russia and Putin, and in some cases Medvedev, although actually I think it's more Putin, that they should be coming more to the West, but even more important, they need to be building their constituency inside their country. Traveling to Russia or to the West is all well and good, but if they don't build up their popularity and support and a foundation inside their country, then they're not going to have a political future. So I'm not sure what value there really comes from trips like that to Moscow, at least on the regular basis that we've seen from some of these political figures.